stream via live stream, and thanks to everybody who's here with me tonight. It's a beautiful night here in Dutchess County, and I'm really glad that you decided to spend a few minutes of it here with me talking about my book, Chicago 63. I promise I am not going to talk too much because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I want to hear your feedback. And if you have any experiences with the subject matter, it helps me in my future work as well. So this is very much a dialogue. And don't be afraid to ask questions at any time. You can interrupt me whenever you want. The first thing that I do whenever I'm writing a book, and I've written 30 of them by now, all different types. I've got them over here. I've written, as I mentioned earlier, I've written thrillers, I've written crime novels, and I've written westerns. It's funny with a guy like me, my accent from the Bronx, writing about westerns, but I have. And because at its heart, it's all about storytelling. It's all about being able to relate with the characters I create with the audience that I'm trying to reach. So when I was starting any of these books, I got some great feedback from a mentor of mine whose name is Michael Frost Beckner. He has written a bunch of movies. He wrote Spy Game, a great movie with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. He also wrote the Sniper movie, the first one with Tom Berenger, that's been made into like 8 different movies since then. And he had a great piece of advice for me. He said, whenever you're going to start a new project, answer 2 questions. Why this book and why now? No matter when it's set, whether it's a mystery, whether it's a thriller, whether it's a Western. Why are modern audiences going to care about this? Because that's who I'm writing for. No matter when the story's set, I'm writing for people in today's world. So as I was thinking about doing something historical and doing something set in 1963, because I had always been fascinated with conspiracy theories in general. I always enjoyed them. UFOs, Bigfoot, Hollow Earth stuff, and the JFK assassination. Now, with all of those other things, UFOs, Sasquatch, ancient aliens, all of that stuff, I was always able to come up with something that had a modern day common sense solution. The UFOs don't necessarily need to be from another world. They're probably just technology we don't already know about. There was several years ago, there was a craze, for example, about flying rods. And everyone said, oh, that's proof that they are alien beings. No, they were drones that we didn't know we had. And then 6 months later, it came out they were drones, and they were all over the news. Then you have Sasquatch. I said, it's probably a misidentification of something else. Ancient aliens, how do all these people build the same kind of buildings all over the world? I figured people got around a lot better in wooden boats than we thought. That's the biggest answer, the best answer you can come up with, instead of somebody coming from out of the sky and building stone buildings and leaving. But the JFK assassination always stuck with me as something, as a nut that I couldn't crack. And the reason is because when you look at the event itself, you say, okay, shots could have come from here. This person could have done that. It's feasible. It's possible. People get lost in the physics, where people were on that specific day, what they heard. But getting away from what you see, and especially in the Zapruder film, when you start delving into the secondary characters who were involved, both with Oswald in Dallas and with the people in his orbit, that's when things start getting very interesting. And when I started looking at that, that's where I started coming up with an idea that I could add something to this in my own way. And that's how Chicago 63 was born. So as I was following my buddy's advice about why this book, why now? JFK's been done to death. What new could I add to it? I started doing some research, like I do for all of my books. With my thrillers, I looked at technology and I looked at spycraft. With my westerns, I made damn sure I knew what parts of a saddle were, and stagecoaches and armaments, because I'm telling you, if you get that stuff wrong, and I have, they will come out of the woodwork at you, and they've got a right. They spent their money on these books. They have a right to authenticity. And for my crime novels, I did a lot of research into the period I was writing about, 1930s New York, because I didn't want it to be a Jimmy Cagney movie. I wanted it to be my story set in a certain time so that it conveyed the kind of story I wanted to tell. I did the same thing with Chicago 63. I looked at the era and I said, what is possibly relatable from then to today? We're a different society now. We're a modern society. We've got the internet. They didn't have that back then. And we have an idealized idea of what the 60s were about. When we think about that today, we think about Mad Men. We think about chic clothes and cigarettes and cocktails and wholesomeness and Camelot. It wasn't like that. As a matter of fact, back then was a lot similar to today and a lot more similar than we think. One of the things I did as I was doing my research, I came up with a graphic that helped explain all of the similarities between 63 and 2023 when I started writing the book. Now it's 2024. But one of the things I focused on was what was going on in the world. Well, one of them was turmoil. Back then, you had hippies, protests, free love, rebellion, and racial strife. What do we have today? Turmoil. We've got Antifa, BLM, LGBTQ rights, rebellion, and racial strife. Back then, they had the same exact thing going on. Today, back in 63, we had war. We had the Korean War, Vietnam, the Cold War, and communist aggression. What do we have today? Middle East, the Ukraine, Russian/communist aggression all over the world. You also have politics. We look at it nowadays, we think of Kennedy and coiffness and coolness, and everything was fine. Not so. Back then, Kennedy was a president in crisis. That's not political, that's just fact. He was in trouble over the Bay of Pigs. He was in trouble over the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was seen as soft on communism by people in his own government. He was under fire, and that was before Dallas. In today's political realm, we have a president in crisis who's constantly coming under a lot of criticism. We have a presidential campaign going on, just like we did in 1963. Kennedy was up for election in 1964. This year, we've got a presidential election coming up. A lot of the ideas I just mentioned earlier are still valid today, and they were valid in both elections. Scandals. We all know about JFK and the rumors about him and Marilyn Monroe and other women. It wasn't just that, though. Some of the scandals that they had in 1963, rumors of election interference when JFK got elected in Chicago. LBJ had his Bobby Baker scandal, something we don't all know about, but it was true. Then you had the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I just mentioned. LBJ was also in trouble. He was the vice president. There was rumors that he was going to be arrested because of the Bobby Baker scandal before he was at the convention in 1964. That was very true. It was even, I have here, the cover of Life magazine the week before JFK was assassinated in early November. It was a big scandal. We forget about it now, but it was huge back then. Today, we have some of the same similar scandals. We've got election interference, the laptop from hell, classified documents, Ukraine funding, impeachments, and the like. Whatever changes, the more it stays the same. We also had militants, too, back then. You had pro and anti-segregationists. You also have militants today, MAGA, Antifa, etc. So there were problems back in 1963. There were problems today. And that's what made Chicago 63 relevant to me. What about it? What was it about my research that made me want to write about this particular era? Why not just save it for JFK book that I'm doing right now? I'm doing a trilogy based on the lead up to that. Well, I was noodling this book, and I was talking to a friend of mine who said, you know what? I know you're trying to shop this JFK story around, but do you have an idea that might be smaller than that, something that's more digestible, like a short story or a novella? And I said, well, there's a certain part of the book that I'm writing now that I really love, and I love the main character, but he disappears about a third into the book because there's just not enough for him to do to justify him being around for longer than that. So he said, well, why don't you put it into a novella and let's see if we can't sell it. So out of that conversation, my good friend James Apt, who's listening, God love you, and we started Silverback Publishing, and the idea of Chicago 63 was born. I took it out of a greater book, a larger book, and I condensed it into 96 pages. What are we talking about here? I try to capture a little bit of what I just mentioned about turmoil, war, politics, scandal, and militants in this novella. I did that by talking about something that came up in my research into all of this stuff. And that was an original plot to assassinate JFK in Chicago 2 weeks before the events of Dallas. Why Chicago? As I said here, he had a lot of friends in Chicago from when he was running for president. When he was hard on the mob, and his brother Bobby was hard on the mob, those friends became enemies. They weren't too happy with him. He lost them Cuba. He lost them a valuable place to launder money. Cuba was a good place to launder money. Haiti was another one, too. We still had Haiti, but they needed also the drugs that used to come in and out of Cuba as well. It was a big hit for them. Plus, he was going after their union operations here. That wasn't good. So he was going to Chicago in 1963 in early November to attend the Army Air Force game in Soldier Field. And at that time, once that was announced, there was a small group of people that got together who had already been part of some of the broader aims of the government to overthrow Cuba. And they said, we're going to take care of him now, right while he's here. In the book, I talk about two people who actually existed. They come together and they say that they are going to put together a small team of people they already had, and they are going to try to execute the president while he is in Chicago. And this plot was actually true. And when you hear the details, they're going to sound a little bit familiar. The president was supposed to land in an airport. He was going to drive through the city in a motorcade. He was supposed to stop and slowly turn through several 90-degree slow turns through the heart of the city, where a bunch of warehouses were. Sound familiar? And then go on toward the game where he was supposed to be. The places where they were going to attack him were as he was doing the slow turn off the highway from a warehouse. And they had a patsy signed up to do it. His name was Thomas Valley. And he was arrested because of his role in this plot. When he was arrested, they found no weapons on him, but they found a trunk full of ammunition. And he was on his way to work, which was right off the highway in a warehouse along the route. They had also arrested 2 out of 4 Cuban assassins who were seen in a rooming house with scoped rifles. They only arrested 2 of them, but they were there. And what happened to those people? Miraculously, we have no evidence about what happened to them. It's funny, isn't it? Just like we don't have a lot of evidence about what the Secret Service involvement was in Dealey Plaza that day in Dallas 2 weeks later. When I was doing this book, I had a lot of information. I had a lot of really interesting stuff that I thought was going to be great, that met all of this criteria of why this, why now. But I needed a hero. And in real life, the people I just mentioned to you, they were uncovered by a very small group of investigators who were on the ground in advance of the president's trip to Chicago. You think today, whenever the president goes someplace, whenever the vice president goes someplace, there is an army of people. Wasn't like that in 1963. The Secret Service was very small. They didn't have endless resources. And the FBI, who we all look at today as being a super agency, they said, you know what? This is a Secret Service thing. We'll do investigations. We're not protection. That's your business. So the Secret Service had to rely on a small group of investigators in an 8-person field office in Chicago and local police departments who weren't necessarily friends of the president. And that was the same thing with this book as well. I get into that. And I tell it in as action-packed a way as I can. I still didn't need a hero. I didn't have a hero. And the more I researched it, the more I came up with one, a real-life person, too. His name was Abraham Bolden in real life. In my book, I changed his name to Golden. I did that because he does things that Abraham Bolden didn't do in real life. Abraham Bolden, in real life, found out about this as a member of the Secret Service office in Chicago. Now, Bolden was a hero in real life for another reason. He was the first black field officer in the Secret Service who had ever been assigned to a presidential protection detail. He was called by Kennedy as the Jackie Robinson of the Secret Service. And I figured if I'm going to have a hero of this kind of a story, this guy is it. The other reason why I picked him is because he's one of the few reasons why we know about this plot today. Because he tried to go public to the Warren Commission in '64 about what he was able to learn of the plot that happened only a few months earlier. They didn't want to hear it because when it came to the Warren Commission, everything was silenced. Everything was fast. There was one person who shot, one area, 3 bullets. That's it. Because that's all they found. That's all they wanted. Because anything more was evidence of a conspiracy, and the world was already teetering on an edge. Why? Because, like I said, communist aggression, lost Cuba, Russia was on the march. They didn't want to risk any kind of war or calls for invasion or any kind of instability in the country. It wasn't just outside. Why in the country? Because of what I said earlier. You had anti-segregationists. You had people who didn't like Kennedy's liberal views. They didn't want a deep investigation that may uncover all of the people running around doing all of this stuff. So they just wanted it to go away. And they didn't think anybody was ever going to read the Warren Commission. And they never counted on anybody seeing the Zapruder film. You can look at it now through the lens of history and say, oh, they were evil people. These are our psychopathic overlords who just want to control what we do every day. That's not it. I really don't believe that. Nothing that I found shows me that that was the case. I think you had a lot of good people who were scared, and for good reason, and they wanted peace in the country because they were afraid of what was going to happen next. So under the context of all of that, I made the person who put a lot of his life on the line to get this information out the hero of my story. And there's also something else that happens with him. After he went to the Warren Commission and was shot down in 1964 about going public with this plot, a few years later, he was set up in a bribery scandal and sent to jail for 7 years in a federal prison. And in 2022, I believe, he got out in the early 70s, I believe. But in 2022, President Biden commuted his sentence and gave him a full pardon because of his efforts to try to get the word out on this. So people can go, as I was saying before we started filming, people can go crazy, and they have, with various ideas about what happened in Dealey Plaza, what happened on that day, who was involved, how many shooters there were. The one thing to remember is that the truth isn't found just in that one plaza, but in the people who were involved outside of it, the secondary people, those who knew what was going on, people who were involved with the Oswald family, and the people who were involved in the secondary people in Oswald's life when he was in New Orleans and when he was in Dallas. That's where the magic happens, and that's where the truth can be found. And that's where I hope to continue to write my stories. And so that's the story of Dallas 63. That's the story behind the plot. Chicago 63. Dallas 63 is what I'm writing now.
Oh, okay.
It's a trilogy that I'm going to be writing for Level Best Books. It's going to be my biggest work yet. And so out of Dallas 63 came Chicago 63. So that's the story of how I came up with this. I'm sure some of you have questions or comments that you have about this fascinating period in American history, and I'd love to hear them. Yes?
So
Historical fiction, yes.
And Dallas 63 is supposed to be fiction as well.
It is based on a lot of facts that have come to light in recent years as people have dug into those tertiary characters that I've mentioned.
And that's perfectly, I understand that, and that's fine. But I get the impression from what you're saying that, number one, you actually think there was a conspiracy in Dallas in 63, and that the Warren Commission is false. The conclusion of the Warren Commission is false.
I think it was rushed on purpose.
Okay, now, my question is this. There have been two very large studies of the assassination and of the Warren Commission.
Mm-hmm.
One was done by an author named Posner.
Yes.
And he wrote a book called Case Closed,
Mm-hmm.
a very large book. Another study was done by Walter Cronkite, and I think it was on PBS or maybe on CBS as well. It was a Nova special.
Yeah, on PBS.
In that Nova special, as I recall, it's years ago that I actually saw it, they were able to scientifically demonstrate that a shooter from the 6th floor of the book depository was able to do what in fact happened, given the way the car turned and the way Kennedy's head turned and the fact that he wore a back brace that eliminated him from going forward from the first shot. And I wondered if you had looked at all that and what your opinion of those two sources is.
Sure, and there's also another book that supports that theory, which was written by Vincent Bugliosi, who did Helter Skelter. He did another book that delves into it. I think that without the exact measurements of the brain, it's very tough to figure out where all of the shots came from. If you listen to the testimony of the doctors of Parkland on that day in Dallas, all of them report an exit wound at the back of the head, not the front. And also, if you see the damage that was done to his skull, and I'm not a forensic scientist, but I've listened to a lot of forensic scientists talk about this, the damage would have been right here to the entire front of his face. None of the pictures that we see show that. I don't think that it's possible that the shot could have created that much damage here if it came from behind and not up here. I don't know how many shooters there were. I do think that one was probably in the Daltex building, which is across the street and slightly ajar from the Dallas School Book Depository, because they found a lot of people who didn't belong in there that day. One of them was a gentleman by the name of Jim Braden, who was a known mobster, who the elevator operator caught coming out of that building saying, "Oh, I was just up here to use a phone." Meanwhile, he had close ties to the mob back in Louisiana, especially Carlos Marcello. So for me, and there was also photographic evidence that one of the people who is suggested to be in that part of the conspiracy, a guy named Joseph Miltier, who was a known racist, extremist, anti-segregationist, was in Dealey Plaza that day. There's a picture of him that's pretty clear, and it looks awfully like him. So I think that without having the exact brain to know where the bullet angles came from, we have a lot of suspect sources to look at it. And then when you look at the 6th floor shooter's nest, supposedly itself, you have to ask yourself, why, and not to get too much into the weeds here, but why wouldn't you shoot at him as he was coming toward you instead of waiting until he turns slowly and he's halfway down the block, especially if you hadn't touched the rifle in 4 years?
And the brain.
Well, that's what I was saying. The brain is
all of a sudden, it's gone. And again, the guy who was on the Warren Commission was the head of the CIA.
Right.
He put himself right on there, and he made sure he put everything. It's okay. It's okay.
Right.
I mean, this is all documented.
It is documented. And
the brain is gone.
Well, the brain was later buried with the president. Apparently, they opened the crypt again when they placed Jackie in there with him, and the brain, a lot of people have attested to, is in there in a box. But we have never really seen any measure. Yeah, it's a Catholic thing. They feel like the whole thing has to be together. It was missing for a while. Yeah, now some people say it was always there. Again, once you get into that, it gets a little crazy.
As So I just want to know what you think is wrong with the Nova. It was the Nova piece. Look, I was a total conspiracy theorist.
Right.
I thought the mob took Kennedy out. I got it that Bobby was going after all the mobsters in Chicago. Jack was sleeping with Gian, whatever.
Oh, Giancana's girlfriend.
I got all
Just
that.
repeat the question for the.
What is wrong with the Nova stuff? Because that struck me as pretty scientific in terms of the path of the bullets and how. I thought it was, they had the detail, they had a model, they did it all. And since you're an expert, I just wondered what was wrong with the Nova special.
Right. The judge, for those at home who might not have heard, the gentleman asked what was wrong, what do I think might have been inaccurate about the Nova special that's been broadcast on PBS for years. For me, when you look, and I'm not a forensic expert, and I'm certainly not a gun expert, but from what I've seen and a lot of the material I've read, the wound that hit Kennedy, if you say it was from behind, didn't line up directly with a lot of the wounds that Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of him, but not directly in front of him. A lot of people will say that they're wrong about this. Governor Connolly was not in front of him like you would be if someone sat behind you in your car on your way home. He was in a jump seat. He was lower and he was further over to the left than we might think. Even with that, if you say the bullet went through the back of his neck, out his front, and straight ahead, it still doesn't line up with how Connolly's wounds are. And those are documented. And Connolly himself always said he never got hit with the same bullet that struck the president. The other thing that the Nova special, from my memory, and I might be wrong about this, so don't email me, everybody, because I might be wrong. It's been a while since I've seen this, is that the entrance wound that the Nova special talks about at the back of his neck doesn't line up with the throat exit, because there was no entrance wound up here. It was further down his back, and it didn't transmit. It didn't go all the way through. So a lot of people think that might have been another caliber bullet that struck him in the back, but it didn't come out. A lot of people say the first shot came when he goes like this, was when it came from the front. Now, some people say if it came from the back, he would have gone like this. Instead, they said if you get hit, you don't go like this. If you got hit in the back of the neck, you grab where you were hit. Some people say that's why it came from the front and it went down. And other bullets hit Connolly. And Connolly always said that too. So the other thing is, if you want to get into, for me, if you get into the sixth floor books about the depository itself, you look at the way they photographed the bullets that they found that were ejected from the bolt-action rifle. They're leaned up against the wall, like somebody dropped them and then put their foot and put them in front of the wall. They're not scattered around like that. Also, the other thing is, why did Oswald, if he brought a rifle to work, why did he have to go home and get his pistol? If you were going to go and kill the president, you're already bringing a rifle. Why wouldn't you bring your .38 with you if you thought you were going to have to get away? There are also a lot of people that are tangentially involved with Oswald that have very suspicious backgrounds too. So when I take all of that together, especially the physical evidence, I'm skeptical that there were shots directly from the depository and that window itself. There were reports of people in the other parts of the sixth floor. There was also a Mauser that was found on the rooftop of the school book depository that day. When the Warren Commission asked about that, they said, oh, it was just a cop who left it. And nobody asked, what cop? Why? Was that his personal weapon? Yeah, but he left it. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Now, I know it was 1963, but I can't imagine a cop getting away with saying, I just forgot my weapon, Sarge. Sorry about that. Those are the kinds of inconsistencies that lead me to think that there was something more going on. I know the Nova special. I know the Bugliosi work. I know Posner's work. And Posner was right about, he was one of the first people that highlighted that Connolly wasn't directly in front of him. He was to the side and lower. It's just the physical evidence for me is still wanting. And that's in hindsight. That's in hindsight. For me. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
About Sinatra.
Sinatra, oh God.
How was it? Because I know he was, very
helpful to get Kennedy in as president. But with the whole mob thing that was going on with Bobby and everything else, what happened towards the end of '63, when now they had, he was going to go up for re-election, where was the loyalty or the amount of enthusiasm from Sinatra?
Yeah, he kind of, well, the Kennedys actually kind of boxed him out and pushed him out. They didn't want anything to do with him at that point because they were afraid of being associated with the same people who, I'm not saying they got him into office, but they worked really hard with Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, to get him into office. People forget about, you want to do some digging, look into Joe Kennedy. I'm telling you, he had a lot of skeletons in his closet. I mean, he's got more skeletons at a boneyard. But look into him and some of the people that he dealt with. He's also one of the wealthiest men in the world. People tend to forget that. But yeah, he didn't. I think Sinatra was on the outs then, and he was upset about it. He was also upset because a lot of his friends were upset with him for what he had gotten them into. And also, people forget, I don't get into it in this book, and I don't get into it in Dallas 63, because that book is primarily a crime story set in Dallas about a greater event. So I talk about the people who were involved, as I said, the tertiary characters, like Jack Ruby, for example, and the people that Ruby dealt with. I'll tell you another family that I'm interested in, but I'm not going to do it on camera because I don't want to get sued. But and they're very litigious. But if you know the research, you'll know what I'm talking about. With those people, and especially with people like Sinatra, they were also seen as the Hollywood people too. And you had the people who were tied in with the Kennedys through the Lawfords and all of those people. And they look at the world a little bit differently than we do. So I think there were a lot of people who were upset with JFK, and I think they made their presence known later on. Anybody else have any questions? Do you have any question? No?
No, I'm just trying to take it all in.
It's a lot to take in, isn't it? And there's so much to it too. I mean, and like you were saying, there are, for every Nova documentary, if you go on YouTube, you'll see 8 different people who have other ideas, and a lot of them are researched. To your point, to give you an example, there's one awesome book where this guy goes into a ton of irregularities in Oswald's life. And he talks about there being 2 Oswalds. All his life, the government raised the double, and they raised Oswald. And you look at this, and I'm thinking, do you think the government's going to create somebody from the bottom up their whole lives and create a false identity for them from when they're toddlers? But when you look at some of his research, I don't believe there were 2 Oswalds. But when you look at some of the irregularities that he goes into in Oswald's life, as he creates this premise, it's fascinating to see what he uncovers. And he does uncover a lot of irregularities. There's a lot of things that you can get into with this case. After the assassination, one of the big ones that people don't talk about, but has a lot of information out there, is the assassination of J.D. Tippit, who was killed by Oswald, supposedly, after he goes to his rooming house, gets his gun, and flees the scene. We think that's a clear-cut case. In recent years, in the last 10, 15 years, people have dug into it. It's totally not. We think everyone saw Oswald shoot Tippit, run to the Texas Theater, and he got caught. No.
You mean that didn't happen?
That Tippit got killed, but in terms of who shot him, there were people who saw 2 people. There were people who, and all of the witnesses only reported 3 shots, but Tippit was shot 4 times. One with a coup de grace to the head. None of the witnesses who were there at that day saw that. They all said 3 shots. The other thing, in that part of town, that specific area where Tippit was shot on that block at 10th and Patton, was used as a crash pad for whose associates in the nightlife in Dallas? Jack Ruby.
So your opinion, was there multiple reasons why?
I think it was, my whole supposition is that it was not a grand conspiracy of J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the CIA, coming together and using these nobodies to make this work. I think it was the work of people who were anti-segregationists, racists, rabid anti-communists, who said Kennedy has to go. And, well, yeah, they also were war profiteers. I mean, a lot of that, to use a politician's favorite thing, then.
Did you hear about that letter on his desk that pulled him out?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yeah. But I don't think it was the mafia. I don't think it was, I do not think it was just a one reason why it happened. I think you had a lot of intersecting interests who came together, and there was only probably about 5 or 10 people who knew what was going on. Because the gentleman that they questioned a lot about his involvement, a guy named Miltier, he said, if you're ever going to do this, you have to keep it small. Because if you expand it, with everyone who knows, the threat of being discovered is multiplied. And that's with anything. Exactly right. So he kept I think they kept it small. And there was also another attempt after Chicago to assassinate him in Miami a week before Dallas. And the guy I just mentioned, Miltier, was on tape, an FBI informant, saying that they had people ready to shoot him when he was in Miami.
So you're gonna rate Miami 63?
I might mention it in this one.
Did you study the hearings that were done in the 70s? I think it was done by a select committee or a Senate committee in 76 or going forward.
Yes.
Goldwater on it, Senator Hart and all those people.
They did, yeah. And Hart himself even said that, and I think, no, he didn't say this, but one of the senators, I believe, who looked into it did. They said if you look at Oswald, the fingerprints of intelligence are all over him.
Well, Hart
Hart thought the mafia killed him. Yeah, I don't think it was. I honestly don't. It's neater to say, oh, these people did it, this did it. I think it was 5 people who had the means and opportunity to do this. There were also the camps that the mafia did pay for that were in Louisiana that were being used as possible staging areas to launch an invasion in Cuba. They were raided, and people say, I've had people tell me at things like this, they'll say, oh, that didn't happen. That's just a bunch of conspiracy theory nonsense. No, Bobby Kennedy had the Justice Department and the FBI raid camps in Louisiana, and they uncovered munitions there, and people who
knew about all this? Do you think he knew the truth?
I think he deduced it because there were a lot of the stuff I've read said that he was more angry than sad when this happened because he recognized the plot. Because this was exactly the same plot they were going to use to kill Castro.
He had no relationship with Johnson. He didn't like him.
No. And Johnson, like I said, if you look at anything, even if you... The problem is that when we look at stuff like this, we look at it from these people are hyper-intelligent, hyper-organized, and they're unrelatable to us. As a matter of fact, they're people who were just like us who rose to these positions. Very few of them grew up in a position of privilege and don't understand what we go through in everyday life. With a guy like Johnson, people say he was the grand architect. I never bought that. Why? Because Johnson was in trouble. He was a liability. He was also a crybaby in real life. Every time, a big, tall guy, tough guy, but when he got too angry or he thought you weren't believing him, and you can look this up, tears streaming down his face. Yeah. Yeah, he had tears streaming down his face, and he'd practically beg you to go along with him. Yeah, and grabbing your lapels or going to the bathroom in front, which he did. He left the door open and had meetings. He's a weirdo. But he was in trouble. And if you're... Sure, and a lot of people don't. And this is all stuff that people can look up. It's called the Bobby Baker scandal. Yeah. And it was on you can take a look at it here. It was the cover of Life magazine.
That was the cover they pulled because it was supposed to come out right after he was assassinated.
I believe they may have pulled it. Yeah. But and this happened. He was in trouble. And if you're going to put something like this together, especially if you're somebody like Miltier or you have somebody who has some kind of tactical experience or some kind of mafia experience, you're not going to want to tell a politician who's in trouble, who's looking for a lifeline about what's going on. And I also don't think Johnson, as manipulative and capable and in some ways evil as he was, Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of JFK, was his best friend, and his wife was sitting in the car. I don't see him sacrificing them in something like this. And I certainly don't think the organizers would have told LBJ about this. Now, there's some people who say he was ruthless, he would have done it. I don't buy that part of it. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong.
Scandal for Johnson? What was when he was in trouble?
Oh, the Bobby Baker scandal? Yeah, that was when it was a gentleman who was a Johnson lieutenant when he was in the Senate, took care of all of his dirty work for him, knew where all the bodies were buried, and he got in trouble for a grain scandal, I believe, in Dallas. The government, like they do with the fuel reserves, would have grain reserves in case of a problem or a national crisis. And what Bobby Baker, I believe, did was they sold that grain and didn't tell the government. And he kept the money. So when that came out, he was tied to Johnson. This guy knew all of Johnson's dirty laundry, and they were afraid that it was going to get out. So as this Bobby Baker scandal was starting to blow up, a lot of people thought he was going to be off the ticket in 64. Now, some say that was Johnson's motivation for being for being behind this. But when you look at the people it took to set this up, I think it was small. I don't think they would have involved him.
So do you think the Secret Service was involved, or anything?
No, I think that they had just thwarted two reasonably valid attacks on him in Chicago and in Dallas, and in Chicago and in Miami, and I think they were a little lackadaisical. They were certainly hungover from the night before where they were partying. I don't think that kind of thing would happen today without it being corrected. It certainly wasn't. We've heard about Secret Service in recent years clamping down on that kind of stuff. But I don't think it was outside of 5-10 people who knew about it.
So how did it come?
Sure.
I mean, the other thing that cuts against Johnson being involved is the whole purpose of them going to Dallas was to try to reunite the Democratic Party in Texas, which was split between Connolly's faction on the one hand and Senator Yarborough's faction on the other. And JFK had given Johnson specific instructions that he wanted Johnson to go down there and bring everybody together because they needed to win Texas
Yeah.
to win the election. So getting rid of Johnson, I think, would hurt Kennedy on that score.
Yeah, I think it might have, but he went to Dallas because he was in trouble because of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the general unrest in the country over segregation. So he was in trouble. I'm not saying he was going to lose, but he was in trouble, and he went down there to solidify the South behind him. And I think it worked, but would Johnson have been kicked off the ticket because of this? I don't know, but I use this scandal, the Bobby Baker scandal, as, for me, not proof, but making it very unlikely that anyone would have trusted him since he was in trouble legally with any kind of a plot like that. Now, whether or not he would have been taken off the ballot, I have no idea. There's a lot.
I just lived in rose-colored glasses my whole life until about the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, these things, I mean, you know all this stuff. I obviously didn't, but I just believed everything they always told me.
And that's the problem.
Well, and that is
so scary.
Well, that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to write the book. It's not to make a certain political point about Democrats or Republicans, but it's that when I was mentioning earlier about the similarities between 63 and 2024, back then, as of now, and even back in the 1920s and 30s, it's always good to have a healthy skepticism about what people are telling you, especially from the government. Just skepticism, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, not disbelieving everything they say just because they say it, but a healthy bit of skepticism in everything in life is a useful tool to have.
I was in English class. I went to high school on Long Island, and an English teacher got up in front of us one day and said, "Has any of you ever seen the president?" Well, of course, none of us have. She goes, "How do you know he really exists?" That was the closest I ever came to anybody, and that just like, I was like, "What are you talking about, Miss Greenberg? Of course he exists."
Right.
But I think she was trying to get us to think.
The moon landing is fake.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing too. I mean, I don't think everything is a conspiracy because I spent 25 years in government, and I'm telling you, they're not that competent to pull off something like that. It's
people still alive today?
the people I'm hesitant to talk about that I mentioned earlier. One of them is still alive and very litigious. The people. Abraham Bolden, thank God, is still with us. He wrote a book recently called Echoes of Dealey Plaza that I highly recommend. And look, none of this stuff that anybody tells you, whether it's me today or the people I reference in Chicago 63 in the afterword, don't take them for gospel. Do your own research. Look at it. There are plenty of people who have written about this stuff. And even that book I told you about where there were the two Oswalds, to throw that all out just because I don't agree with that one premise. Some of the facts he uncovers there are fascinating, and he has a good point. I can explain a lot of them away, but a lot of them, the inconsistencies, the irregularities, are pretty good to point out that I didn't think of before. So I always say do your research, look into it yourself, and come to your own conclusions. Look at the documentaries on PBS and Vietnam.
I was just telling you about the doctors that examined him. How did they cover that up? I mean, they said the bullet did not come from here. It came from here. The way it shot, the whole thing. How did the Warren Commission get away?
I think that they were fed an awful lot because there was a choke point of investigation that was just from the FBI. And as I mentioned earlier, they were afraid of all-out war. They were afraid of the American public demanding that they invade Cuba, if that's who the American public blamed for that. And God forbid they were ever to show that there was an internal group of people that did it because of anti-segregation or because of anti-communism. You would have had a real civil war then, unlike the political civil war we've been having since 1993 in this country.
That's one reason why they haven't released all the files.
That's
Right.
what I was just going to say. What about
They
the
still
files?
haven't after 61 years.
Yeah, right.
There's a reason why they're not releasing it.
And I think it's because of what I mentioned earlier, because a lot of people who had secondary involvement in intelligence agencies were they might be alive, but I think that they had involvement with intelligence agencies, and I think they covered it up after the fact because, especially with the FBI, for example, they knew about Oswald running around, and they knew where he was. They knew that he had asked the Russian embassy for asylum when he was supposedly down in Mexico. So if they didn't do anything about that, at the time, the American public would have been in an uproar. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do something about it like we did with the 9/11 hijackers? You know, I mean, and back then, it was a little bit of a simpler time in that people trusted what they were told about with their government. And when they did the Warren Commission, they were pretty sure no one was ever going to read it anyway. And that all changed as people kept digging into it. And then when the Zapruder film came out on Geraldo Rivera's show.
And you never saw it, the full. I mean, I never saw it. Yeah. And when they showed you that part, there's no way that it came from the back. The way his brain exploded.
Yeah.
I mean, his skull. And then the brain came out, flying all over the place in the front.
Yeah.
Not the back.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah, I mean, and you know what? You've had forensic examiners and experts on both sides say, oh, yes, it could have. No, it couldn't have. And as I said before, you could get lost in the details of what happened in that plaza on that day. I think the truth is found when you start looking at the people who were elated as you further get away from it. Now, somebody like Bolden, for example, in my book, he's the hero. His story has changed over the years. Why? Because I think he actually believes it. And as we tell a story, think of a story you told when you were in high school or college and that you relate now. I bet you cut out a lot of stuff. I bet people are jumbled together. Are you intentionally trying to mislead people? Memories change. People change. Memories fade. Even with something like this, I don't think there's a lot of nefarious intent behind this. I think it's just stories evolve. But I can't tell you. No, I'm only kidding. It's funny. I've appeared when I worked for the government. I used to tell people I can't talk about it because they don't want me to say anything about it, which was true. And then when I would tell people I worked for in economic development. I worked for the MTA, and then I worked for Roosevelt Island. And I would have so many guys and women who used to be spies. They'd say, "That's it?" And I said, "Yeah, but they don't want me to say it in front of a microphone." But I don't work for them anymore. So yeah, I did government and community relations work in economic development, transportation, and community development. So I have an understanding about, and I was also the director of communications for Roosevelt Island during the COVID-19 crisis. So when I hear people today saying, "Oh, well, the government was plotting and using this to get us under their thumb," I didn't hear anything like that. I didn't hear anything remotely like that. I heard a lot of people who were working really hard to try to figure out how to get hand sanitizer in different places. Now, did people take advantage of that? In the hindsight, sure, if you look back on it now. But at the time, no one was looking to throw a great big net over everybody and put their grand plan in place. That doesn't mean it didn't inspire some people to think about it since, but I didn't see it at the time. So that's why a healthy skepticism, like I said, about government or what people tell you is always a very good idea. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be here. I appreciate it.